Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick and very pleased to welcome you to our program tonight. I welcome you on behalf of our leadership team, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Chasen, and Caroline Kelly. And I also especially welcome tonight's truly extraordinary Jennifer Rubin and the equally amazing Patt Morrison. Thank you both for being with us tonight to help us become smarter and better informed. From the poll we took a couple of weeks ago, for those of you who are on the program and took the poll, the vast majority of you voted in favor of us continuing our special Israel in Crisis programming in addition to our regular programming. This coming Sunday morning from 10 to 11 a.m., that's Sunday at 10 a.m., we'll hold our 5th Israel in Crisis program featuring the American-born Israeli journalist and thought leader Yossi Klein Halevi in conversation with Rabbi Edward Feinstein. On Monday night, December 11th, we will have our 6th Israel in Crisis program. That's a week from Monday, featuring Aaron David Miller, who spent 24 years with the United States State Department as a Middle East negotiator and is now with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He will be focusing on the Biden administration policy toward the Israel-Hamas war. So we hope that you'll join us for both of those extra programs. Next Wednesday, which is December 6th, we have a very exciting program. Superstar Sarah Longwell, founding editor of The Bulwark and of Republicans Against Trump, will return to America at a Crossroads together with another superstar, Simon Rosenberg, founder of the liberal DC-based think tank New Democrat Network and Policy Institute. You might be familiar with his blog, The Hopium Chronicles. In tonight's email, you'll get a link to both of their publications, and you might want to familiarize yourself with them if you don't already read their pieces. They will be discussing politics looking toward 2024, and they will be in conversation with Larry Mantle. Despite the pain, suffering, and chaos in the world, including the wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and the epic anti-Semitism and hateful conduct we are observing in our own country, including the shooting of 3 young Palestinian students this past week, we hope that you were able to enjoy being with your families and loved ones this past week to celebrate Thanksgiving. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Patt Morrison. Patt is a multi-award-winning, too many for me to announce. She's a veteran journalist, an esteemed writer and columnist with the LA Times, and just an overall extraordinary human being. Please welcome Patt Morrison. Patt?
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's joining us and taking part in these programs that have proven to be so vital in the last weeks and keeping us up to date, which is essentially a week's worth of front page news every single day to monitor what's going on, to assess not only the impact on the rest of the world, but certainly the political repercussions here at home. Your questions for us as we go through the evening, you can put in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can a little later in the program. So we're joined by Jennifer Rubin, the columnist at the Washington Post, who is so prolific. I think she writes a week's worth of news every day. Jennifer, thanks again for joining us.
It is absolutely my pleasure, and I am overawed by the audience that you continue to attract. It looks like over 2,000 of you are listening and watching in. We so appreciate your interest.
So, Jennifer, again, as I said, a week's worth of news per day. We had more hostages released, including another American. You wrote today about Netanyahu and the political consequences for Israel and for him and for Palestinians about what's going on. So why don't you set the table for us in terms of what today represented and a longer look at how this shakes out?
Well, today, of course, was one more of the extended days of the so-called humanitarian pause. And that has come about in large part because of, I think, the way that President Biden has handled this. I think he's learned from his predecessors. Whatever you think of him, Bibi Netanyahu is not one who takes criticism well. He is not one who enjoys being put on the spot or being publicly chastised. Biden learned that, I think, as vice president. And at that point, President Obama got into some, I think, really unnecessary and unwise public fights with Netanyahu, which is easy to do, by the way, since he's very reactive. But I think Biden took away from that an important lesson, which is that, as I put it, the bear hug is better than the tongue lashing. And from the get-go, from the very moment of this horrific attack on October 7, he expressed publicly over and over again, and in private as well, his support for Israel. As he put it, it's right and its obligation to remove Hamas as a terrorist organization and as an existential threat to Israel. And he continued to repeat that. He did not put, at least not publicly, conditions on Israel other than, and this is critical, that it abide by the laws of war. And that has become increasingly of concern, as everyone on this call knows, as the war has progressed, as it always is when Israel is involved in a war against terrorists. It is inevitable.
Let me insert what he said. I believe it was today. He said this will continue until there's no longer a threat to Israel, which could mean anything, virtually anything.
Correct. And that also raises the possibility, or the likelihood, frankly, of more and more civilian casualties. It is impossible, although we would all love, remember those Jewish lasers that we were all supposed to have that MTG said they would come in handy in a war, but there is no surgical way to kill only the terrorists who embed themselves in hospitals, in schools, in nurseries, in homes. And so the casualty count, whatever we think the right number is, and I think there's reason to be skeptical about the numbers that the Gaza Ministry of Health puts out. But as the administration says, thousands of people, whether the number is 3,000, 5,000, 8,000, it is an extraordinary amount of suffering and death. And you cannot be a human being and not feel moved by that, not want it to end. And yet Israel has a responsibility, as the president said, to continue on. So what has President Biden done? What has he accomplished? I think by embracing the prime minister so closely and Israel, and going to Israel during the war, which was an extraordinary event, had never happened in wartime with any American president, he earned the trust of the Israeli people and gained some political capital in order to begin to have these very intense diplomatic conversations with the Israelis, with the Qataris, with the Egyptians. And he also had a team that was ready on the ground and has been extremely active. Secretary Blinken, the CIA director, Bill Burns, who was highly respected. And he's able to not only deploy these people, but himself get involved in hour by hour, day by day discussions. And as a result of that, now over 100 hostages, about 70 of them Israelis, have been released. There has been a surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza. And there is serious discussion as we speak. I checked just before we came on, and they had not resolved it yet, but there was hope that there would be several more days of this pause, meaning more and more hostages might be released. At the same time, President Biden has been clear about two things. One is that especially as Israel turns to the south, remember most of the fighting now has been in North Gaza, it is going to become even more difficult to avoid civilian casualties. Remember, hundreds of thousands of Gazans were moved from the north to the south because the north was the initial contact point for the Israeli army, Gaza City and the other areas. So now they are turning to an incredibly densely populated area in which these people have been told to go to. And the president has been trying privately and now publicly through his spokesman and through his direct comments to explain that it is incredibly important for Israel to devise some kind of strategy that is different than the bombing, than the mass casualty events that they saw in the northern part of Gaza. Now, I'm not a military expert. I don't know whether that is possible. He is talking to the Israelis. Our military is having military to military contacts. Our intelligence officials are having contact with their intelligence officials, but we really don't know on the ground what is possible, how surgical, how careful Israel can be. And this, of course, is the great dilemma, in which rightly has upset so many Americans, so many people around the world. The other thing that the president has done is he has, with increasing fervor, with increasing sense of purpose, made clear that after this is over, Israel should not reoccupy Gaza. Remember, in 2005, 2006, they withdrew entirely, and that there must be some kind of transition. What that will be, we don't know. As your previous guests, including the marvelous Dennis Ross, has pointed out, the PA really isn't capable at this point of taking over a massive responsibility that would include all kinds of rebuilding and restoration and management of millions, if not billions, of dollars. So there's going to have to be some kind of transition body. But the president has been clear that this has to lead to some concrete steps that would lead to eventually a final state solution in which you would have 2 states for 2 people. It sounds bizarre that he would raise this and become increasingly emphatic during the war. But I think it's essential that he do that for a couple of reasons. One, it's important that he offer that to people who are rightly concerned about the fate of the Palestinians. Americans, people around the world, the Palestinians themselves, that he offer them something better than simply a return to October 6th. And I think his emphasis on the day after is going to be continuing to ratchet up as the fighting goes on. And I think it's also a reality that, frankly, if Hamas is decimated, there is going to be an opportunity for some kind of talks. The other half of that being that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in all likelihood, is not going to survive this. His approval rating has plummeted. So there may be an opportunity on both sides to have a bizarre opportunity. You don't want to say that a war creates opportunity, but in really the massive destruction and the dislocation, there may be an opportunity to reassemble the pieces in a way that benefits both sides.
Let me ask you, in a context I will set up, about assessing how well Biden and his administration has been doing. And I ask that because there's one faction that thinks that Biden pulls the strings on Netanyahu and can simply tell him to order a ceasefire or withdraw anything that that faction chooses that Biden should be able to do. There's another faction that says that Biden is bent on destroying Israel altogether. A little later, I want to get to some of the domestic protests in this country, but for right now, would you assess how you think Biden is doing and these odd domestic points of view about what he can and cannot do vis-a-vis Israeli politics and military policy?
Well, it may surprise some of his critics, but Israel is a sovereign nation. It's a democratic nation. It makes decisions based upon its self-interest. And some of President Biden's most vociferous critics and some of Israel's seem to think that we can simply order them around and tell them when to fight, when not to fight, that we have some ability to control them. That really misunderstands entirely what the state of Israel is about, which is a sovereign country that acts in its own self-interest like every other country on the planet. And it also misunderstands the relationship that we have with Israel. It is not a vassal state of the United States. It is a partner. It is an ally. That if we want to have input, and we do, if we want to have an effect, you do what President Biden has been doing, which is publicly give support, build a relationship of trust with the Israeli people, and quietly push and push and push and push for both a minimization of the casualties and also, as we were just talking, about a plan for the day after. Now, the other side of the equation that assumes that somehow President Biden is hamstringing Israel, is tying Israel's hands, is equally ridiculous because, of course, every time he appears in public, he has given fulsome support to Israel. He has not conditioned aid. He made one comment that I think confused people the other day, where he said it was something worth considering, but they've since clarified that that is not in the cards. We don't condition aid to Israel. And that he has done everything humanly possible, including sending our warships into the Gulf to try to keep Iran at bay. And that's the other thing we haven't yet talked about, which is the president has been rightly very concerned that this would metastasize into a regional war, that Iran, which has not only ties to Hamas, but to Hezbollah in the north, would sort of unleash Hezbollah, that Iran itself might become engaged in some way, and that this could be really a conflagration that could involve many, many states in the region. And he famously, when he went to Israel and when he has spoken at home, has said, don't, meaning these other powers, these other entities should stay out. And although there has been an exchange of fire back and forth between Iran and its surrogates and our forces, it has not spread. Hezbollah has not in total cleared the border and started a second front war. And that is critical as well. Had President Biden not issued that, we really don't know what would have happened. Iran could have entered the equation. Hezbollah could have gone full throttle. And then Israel would be in deep, deep trouble. So the notion that he has somehow abandoned Israel or disregarded its interest, I think is foolishness. Now, the one party in this equation that should be doing more is Congress. The president set up a supplemental bill very shortly after the outbreak of the war in early October. It's been sitting in Congress. The Republicans can't find their way out of a paper bag. And even though they say they want to support Israel, they first put up a bill that they knew would not pass because it was tied to huge domestic cuts, something that has never been done in the history of US-Israel relationships. We think that there will be a bill before the end of the year that will aid Israel. But for all of you, you should write your congressperson and your senator to tell them to get off the stick. It's $14 billion. And that is money that could very quickly and very usefully be put to Israel's defense and to the massive rebuilding problem and the massive social problems they are experiencing. Remember, several 100,000 people in Israel have been displaced themselves, who they had to clear out of southern Israel, move away from the fighting. So I think the president has operated within the realm of the possible, but done so in a very intensive, very personally engaged way, more so, I think, than perhaps any other president we have had.
In a way that I don't remember seeing since the anti-apartheid demonstrations of the late 80s and into the 90s, Americans have involved themselves, engaged in what is essentially a foreign conflict, not involving the United States directly. And in this case, we've seen it take vehement forms. We have the shooting of 3 young Palestinian students. We have in the Berkeley City Council, home of your alma mater, people standing up, defending Hamas, saying things like, well, Hamas didn't do it, but if they did, it's justified. Just an unbelievable amount of tension and public protest on both sides, demonstrations of anti-Semitism, vandalism. Now we have an involuntary manslaughter charge about a confrontation in Los Angeles, where a Jewish man died a couple of weeks ago. So I'm a little surprised by this, but people seem to be so very invested in this, so personally invested in this. Why is it happening, and what's to be done to allay some of this? The violent anti-Semitic attacks, the attacks on people like these young students.
I don't think anybody on this call or any American Jew was operating under the assumption that anti-Semitism did not exist in America. We remember the Tree of Life shooting. We have seen the steady uptick in anti-Semitic incidents, but I have been personally shocked, horrified by the intensity, by the grotesqueness, by the sense of inhumanity that we have seen. And I think we should be careful to break apart two separate phenomena. One phenomena is, strictly speaking, obscene propaganda on behalf of terrorists. When you rip down the posters of kidnapped victims, when you repeat the chant from the river to the sea, meaning eradicate all of Israel, when you glorify Hamas as martyrs, you are cheering death, destruction, inhumanity, terrorism. And who ultimately is behind that, whether there is a foreign country, whether it's a domestic entity, is deeply wrong, deeply misguided, deeply un-American. We should separate that from the very strong feelings that we have seen, not only in the United States, but around the world, in London, in other European capitals, about this issue. And why the intensity? I think it's a couple things. One is social media has changed the way people engage in politics to a degree that continues to surprise us. Everything is more intense. Everything is more physical and present, and at times violent. We saw that around January 6th, that it has a way of, on the good side, engaging people, elevating people, but also on the bad side, in enraging people, getting them caught up in a mass movement that they may or may not fully understand. And I think it is the level of propaganda and the level of, I think, just general discontent that you see in America that's reflected in all the polls. That is the legacy, the holdover of COVID, of economic stress that has made for an angry populace. And I think the other issue, which we should be frank about, is that many young people are grossly misinformed and grossly underinformed.
Before you go into that, I want to quote your line that Hamas ain't Gaza, Gaza ain't Palestine, and Palestine ain't Islam, Zionism isn't Israel, and Israel isn't Judaism, which seems to encapsulate some of the nature of the misunderstandings you're about to tell us more about.
Exactly. And Senator Schumer, if those of you who haven't caught the news yet today, went to the Senate floor. As he says, he is the highest ranking Jewish politician in America, and gave a very elegant, very prolonged speech on the rise of anti-Semitism. And I think he was generous in his remarks in saying exactly this, that there are many young people who are caught up in the moment, who see the suffering in Gaza, who identify in some respect to the Palestinians, and they haven't spent the time to understand Israel, the Jewish experience, the Holocaust, the founding of Israel, the nature of Israel as a society, the recent history of wars. And without that complexity, it's easy for them to demonize Israel as the strong power, the Palestinians somehow as the weak power. And you see these ridiculous narratives that Israel is a colonizer. The vast majority of Israelis were either born in the Middle East, thrown out of other countries, thrown out of Russia. It was a creation of the United Nations, the entire international community. And it is nothing more, Zionism is nothing more, of course, than the belief that the Jews have a right to a homeland. That's it. And all of the propaganda, all the kind of hate speech that it's a colonizer, that it's somehow shouldn't be in the Middle East at all, is, I think, a combination, frankly, of anti-Semitism on some parts, but also vast ignorance on the other hand. And I do not envy those parents and those kids who are on college campuses who are met with a tsunami of hate and disinformation and misinformation. The Jewish community has been, I think, rightly responding. The ADL, a flurry of other groups have gotten involved to try to provide resources, information. I attended the March for Israel on the Mall, which was a stunning display. 200,000 people, everyone from secular to Haredi Jews, non-Jews, in defense of Israel. But it is an extremely emotional topic, which is easily distorted by malicious people or simply by ignorant people. And I look upon our role here and all of the people who are listening as the antidote. You have to be emissaries. You have to talk to your neighbors, to your friends, to your kids' friends, and be a voice of sanity and perspective, which is so badly missing.
When I hear young people say, I'll never vote for Joe Biden again, I'm wondering what impact this has on the election, which is just a couple of weeks, under a year away.
Well, let's hope that this is a momentary fury, the way we say, I'll never speak to my husband again, in a moment of frustration. But it's not a recipe for the survival of democracy or of any of the views that they hold. Do they really think Donald Trump, who had passed the Muslim ban, who is promising to broaden, whatever that means, the Muslim ban, who is talking about deporting Palestinians born in America, something out of Kamatsu in World War II, the person who has at times threatened or gotten the idea we should go to nuclear war with Iran. Do they really prefer that individual? Aside from the issues of abortion, climate change, democracy. So I think that there is a reflexive, very strong reaction among a certain segment of the Democratic Party, and by people who don't consider themselves Democrats, who are to the left of the Democratic Party. I would hope, and I do believe it will be the case, that when they are presented with a choice between Joe Biden on one hand, who has both helped Israel and done what he could to alleviate the suffering in Gaza, and Donald Trump, who has fed every bad quality that Prime Minister Netanyahu had, every bad inclination, every excess, that they will make an informed choice at that point, that President Biden is infinitely better than Donald Trump. And I would just add that some of these fringe candidates, the no labels movement, the notion that you should vote for one of those folks as an alternative or as a protest is nothing more than a vote for Donald Trump. President Biden needs the entire pro-democracy coalition, which includes soft Republicans, independents, Democrats, socialists, non-aligned people. He needs every vote he can get, because we know that the MAGA side is incredibly tight. They are never going to give up on their guy. They will crawl over glass to vote. And so the coalition in opposition has to be just as determined and just as supportive of President Biden as the others are of former President Trump.
I'm sure we'll have you back in the next year. And one of the points to explore then, although not now, is to what extent numerically the third party candidates in 2016 took the votes from Hillary Clinton that were determinative in states' electoral votes. So I think it's something to mark down. For
absolutely.
The one other point about Israel before we get to more domestic concerns and to our questions is about 7 weeks after the attacks, the Secretary General of the UN has finally called for an investigation into the sexual violence against Israeli women, which was just horrific. There have been op-eds in the newspapers about this. Our co-founder, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, has a piece coming out, I think, in the Jewish Journal, if it's not appeared already, about this. And you wrote about this as well, that this organizations devoted to speaking out against sexual violence against women and of course, rape as an act of war is a war crime, have been silent for the most part on this.
And when it comes to the United Nations, there is only one explanation, and that is Jewish women and Jews in general count less. And that in their fervor to condemn Israel, how many thousands of resolutions have we seen over the years emanating from the United Nations condemning Israel, that they, in the worst way, did not want to address the real suffering of Israelis, the real suffering of Israeli women. Somehow they have got it into their heads that in order to show sympathy for the Palestinian people, you have to exonerate or deny entirely the crimes of Hamas. This is absurd, it's morally reprehensible, and it does a huge disservice to the Palestinian people, who are themselves the objects of violence and terrorism. It was only a week ago that we saw 2 Palestinians lynched in Gaza because they were suspected of being collaborators with Israel. So the notion that we dare not show sympathy for real victims because somehow that will deny sympathy for other victims is preposterous and wrong. I heard today on a Zoom call the First Lady of Israel, Mrs. Herzog, speak very passionately about how in slow steps the Israeli population became aware of this and is still learning about this, in part because many of the victims were killed, in part because of the sheer confusion of everything. They are now beginning a very meticulous process of collecting evidence, of which there is plenty, by the way, including the cameras and the films that the Hamas terrorists took themselves, to document this, to speak to survivors, to speak to witnesses. They think that there were over 1,000 rapes that day in that one afternoon, and some of it so violent that the women's bones were broken. Children, adult women. It is horrific. And she emphasized, the First Lady of Israel emphasized, that it is vital that we not forget, that we not diminish their stories, and that if we're going to say that we believe women, if we're going to say that rape cannot be a weapon of war, if we're going to say that there is a moral obligation to prosecute based upon evidence, there is no excuse, none whatsoever, not to pursue these as war crimes, not to acknowledge the stories. And as you said, today, finally, the UN put something out, but it was about a week ago, I think, that the Commission on Discrimination Against Women from the UN put out a statement that you didn't know whether to cry or to laugh. It said they were very concerned. That sounds like Susan Collins, who was very concerned about a lot of things that President Trump did. That's just absurd. There's no excuse for it. And certainly we would like to see more women's groups in the United States, on the left, in the center, whoever they are, speak out against this. We would like to see that there be an acknowledgement of these horrendous crimes, and that we would like to, I think, be able to recognize that the suffering of one group of people does not diminish the suffering of another. We don't care for the Palestinian children and innocents any less because we recognize that Israeli women and girls were victimized. This is what human rights is about. This is what being a human being is to feeling compassion and empathy for all innocent victims, of which there is always a surplus in the Middle East.
All would like to know when you think there might be an election so there can be a decision about Netanyahu, because there have been suggestions that he, as long as this war goes on, he essentially is a war president and will likely stay put.
There was very little discussion, but some, which is extraordinary when you think about it, that he should step down or resign during the war. That did not get, as you would imagine, any legs in Israel, where they fear that any political tumult at this point would be disruptive. Remember, they did form a so-called war cabinet, which includes Benny Gantz, who is the leader of one of the major opposition groups. And so he has been elevated, if you will, and been given a greater voice. I think the Israeli people who were already gathered in mass demonstrations for more than 30 weeks on the streets, really protesting and speaking out against the judicial reforms, they have not gone away. That sentiment has not gone away. And every poll we see suggests that he would get, they have 61 seats now, that they would get something like 16 seats if the election were held today. So it is not a question of if, but when. And depending upon whether you think that this war is going to be over in a few weeks or a few months, it will end. And I am confident that he will be thrown out. If his party is in any way sensible, they will quickly replace him so that Likud remains as the majority party. But I don't think there's going to be any way to avoid elections. There's certainly going to be all kinds of inquiries. And there are going to be many resignations up and down the line in the military and the intelligence community and the political community. So he will go. For those of us who have seen this politician with more than 9 lives, I think it's finally safe to say that he will go, and he will go down as inarguably one of the worst, if not the worst, prime minister in the history of the state of Israel.
There's a question from Lauren about diplomats in this country, journalists distinguishing Hamas from the Palestinian people, but he points to a poll earlier this month by a respected polling organization headquartered in Ramallah that almost 80% of Palestinians oppose a two-state solution, favor only that river to the sea solution, says it's not a recent development, and unlike the Israelis, they have no interest in sharing the land. So why do US and European diplomats continue to push for a two-state solution if it's not going to be acceptable to one of those two states?
Well, I would take all of that polling with a huge grain of salt. In Gaza, obviously, they live under a terrorist state. And in the West Bank, the PA, well, not a terrorist state, is not a democratic organization, and obviously has maintained a public position yet of non-recognition of the Israeli state. And I think the answer is that when presented with the opportunity to have a state of their own that meets some basic requirements, that is contiguous, that includes the major population centers on the West Bank, that we would hope that there would be a rethinking. And I would ask people at this point to suspend judgment on what it is the Palestinian people want and don't want. Frankly, they've never been given a voice. In Gaza, they had one election and one election only, because after that, Gaza, the Hamas did not allow elections. The PA has gone on for how many years now with Abu Mazen as the really unelected leader with no democracy whatsoever. So I would be wary of the kind of polling results we get. Now, we do confront a serious problem, which is for decades now, the Palestinian people have been subject to horrendous propaganda, to horrendous education, which teaches them to hate Israel, to fear Israel. And undoing that process will not be quick, but I think we should also be candid that statehood is not going to be quick. There's going to have to be a huge process of rebuilding. There's going to have to be reform of the PA. We're not on the verge of granting statehood at this point to anyone. And I think the process will have to go in steps. And this is one of the reasons why it is critical that the administration press for concrete, verifiable steps to improve the lives of Palestinians. Because so long as they fear that there is no future, that they have no economic opportunities, that they have no path to self-determination, they will continue to harbor, understandably from their perspective, great anger and resentment. And we have to get past the notion in which we take the party line of the Arab street as the final word of gospel, on mixing my religious metaphors, but as the final word on the future of the Middle East and the future of two people with two states.
A lot of our viewers acknowledge, of course, that Israel is a sovereign state, but really wondered, does the U.S. not attach any strings to the aid that it sends to Israel and thus give it some leverage?
There are basic requirements that the U.S. attaches to all its military aid, that it will not be used to target civilians, for example. But beyond the same requirements that we provide to all countries, we have not conditioned it. Now, I think people have to appreciate what quiet diplomacy really means. We may not have a legal condition on the aid, but all of the work that the president is doing to persuade the political leaders, all the work that our intelligence community, our military community is doing person to person, is designed to assuage, to goad, to encourage a approach to the war that has less casualties, that has a greater emphasis on humanitarian support and aid. And as the reality is, we are going to see, as Israel turns to the south, whether that amounts to something. Israel is not going to simply end the war with Hamas leadership, with 160 or so hostages still being held, with tunnels in the south, with infrastructure in the south. This is going to go on for a while. So the proof will be in the pudding. And the reason I think you see that President Biden is increasingly publicly vocal about exercising restraint is because he's very concerned about this exact phenomenon. He is very concerned about what happens when Israel turns to the south.
I'd like you to address one more point before we turn to American politics, and that's Ayana's question about the problem of the settlers in the West Bank and whether there's going to be a reset after all of this on that as well.
Well, as everyone is quite aware, there has been an uptick in violence, both settlers extracting violence as well as Palestinians enacting violence. The administration has also been very clear that Israel must act strongly against settler violence, that there is no excuse for this, there is no toleration of this, that the temperatures have to be lowered, that these parties cannot be at war with one another. Obviously, the settlements on the West Bank have spread far and wide, far greater than was the case when the Oslo process began. The reality on the ground has been changed, and it's been changed over the objections of many American presidents, and it remains a problem. That does not mean that they have removed the potential for a two-state solution. It can still be done. But I do think that the administration is going to increasingly put pressure on Israel to show restraint there too, and more importantly, to crack down on the settler violence, which has become horrendous and extraordinary. And we have the situation now, unfortunately, in which Netanyahu's partners are egging on the settlers, using horrendously racist language, using language that speaks in dehumanizing terms. And that remains a central problem and a central concern of the Biden administration.
Speaking of dehumanizing language, much has been going on the domestic political front. Donald Trump referring to his political opponents as vermin, suggesting he would bring in the military in the borders of the United States to quell disturbances, that he would punish his political opponents, that he would pardon a number of people who have been convicted for January 6th. All this against dropping poll numbers for Biden, but at the same time, we see inflation dropping, prices for gas and food dropping, the Fed considering cutting the interest rates, the projects that the Biden administration got passed through Congress going into place with Republican legislators out there cutting the ribbons in some cases for these, Liz Cheney bringing the receipts to for her Republican colleagues' behavior, members of Congress left and right saying, we're not going to run for this anymore. We want out of this mess. How do you think our domestic politics look at this point?
It is certainly enough to give one heartburn. Let me acknowledge that. Let me start with Trump. He is no longer sounding semi-fascist. He has gone full fascist. There's no other way to describe it. And when you are literally quoting the lines from Hitler's speeches, when you are talking about polluted blood, and when you're talking about the destruction of democracy, we should be taking this seriously. This is not a metaphor. He's not making some intellectual argument. This is fascism. This is a guy who was out for revenge. We have heard them. He wants to be his followers' retribution. This is a recipe for totalitarianism, for violence, for the end of our democracy. And I think we've had enough of people saying, oh, you're being hysterical, or he'll never do it, or he'll grow in office. We have seen how he behaves in office, and his last official acts were to encourage a mob to reverse a legally held election and install him as the president of the United States. So I think Americans have to be much more aware and engaged in this. I think the press, which frankly has not been, I think, suitably alarmed, has become more so in recent weeks as the language has turned up and up and up and sounds more and more ominous. And I think that has to continue. We are not in an election in which there are two normal parties, where the debates are, what kind of budget should we have? Or do we have a bigger or smaller defense budget? This is about the survival of democracy. And I think voters need to be reminded of it. I think the president has really not begun his reelection campaign. He makes speeches now and then, but he has not engaged full throttle. And that will begin after the first of the year. There will also be some trials next year, and those trials may or may not result in convictions. At least two of them, I think, will take place next year, the New York criminal trial, but most importantly, the DC trial concerning January 6th. And I think even if you believe the polls, even if you're horrified by the polls, look at the number of people that are affected if Trump is convicted. That sends his numbers plummeting, even among Republicans. And I think the Republicans are sleepwalking themselves into a disastrous situation in which he wins the majority of the delegates, perhaps by Super Tuesday, just as that DC trial is beginning. He winds up being convicted, and they therefore are running for president of the United States, a convicted felon. So although it sounds like Democrats have their hands full, I think Republicans should be a little bit more concerned about the direction in which they're headed.
Well, we just learned that the Koch family, the influential political family, has put its money and its support behind Nikki Haley. Is there any prospect that Trump would not get the nomination?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that she's going to be a good second finisher, that she's the one with the momentum. She has not taken on the aura of a loser, an obnoxious loser, as Governor DeSantis has. She hasn't prattled on like an idiot the way Vivek Ramaswamy has. So she is somewhat afloat. And there are Republicans who are coming to the conclusion, it's not just the Koch brothers. Now Jamie Dimon is talking to her, other Republicans who are saying she's it. She's the only possible alternative. But the problem is the voters. They don't pick. As powerful as the Koch brothers, or now one of the Kochs, is, and as powerful as some of these big donors are, it is the voters who pick their nominee. And until Republican voters decide that he is a threat to them, a threat to the country, that he may put them in this position I just described, where they're running a convicted felon who then drags down the entire ticket, he will be the nominee. So I wouldn't bet the ranch on it, but maybe part of the ranch that Donald Trump will in fact be the nominee. I gotta say, for a long time, I thought it impossible. I thought the Republicans cannot possibly do this. But once you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, and their ability to deny, to rationalize, is really boundless. And you have millions of people who are not going to step away from them.
Well, we saw that part of that rationalization with the emails that Liz Cheney and Kevin McCarthy exchanged when, after the 2020 election, when Trump knew he lost, he was in Mar-a-Lago, and according to several sources, he was depressed and not eating, which is a gift to late night comedians in itself. But that's why Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago, and Liz Cheney was incredulous about this. So you have Republicans who, for reasons of fear, apart from support, are saying, well, if he's going to be our guy, I guess I've got to get behind him anyway and protect him and make sure.
I mean, this tribal loyalty is so extreme that they wind up rationalizing where they have come. Now, on that Kevin McCarthy story, I can't figure out whether they told him that and Kevin McCarthy, being such a fool, actually believed it, or whether he came up with this cock and bull story to tell Liz Cheney. Either way, it tells you a lot about Kevin McCarthy. And if there's anyone that Liz Cheney has more contempt for than Kevin McCarthy, I haven't seen it yet. So I'm dying to get this book as well. We've heard some of the blockbuster stories. I'm sure there are going to be more. But I think she is, the reason she's so hated in the Republican Party is she is a walking, talking, living example of what a person of conscience should be doing, what someone who is a patriot should be doing, what someone who believes in objective reality should be doing. And it drives them insane because they have all gone down another path. So God bless her. We all have, I think, varying degrees of support for what she said in the past or what she's done in the past, but I don't think anyone can doubt her sincerity in terms of trying to warn her party, trying to warn the American people. And I look forward to the book.
So given that the life of speakers of the House can be measured in scaramucci's, we don't know what's going to happen with Speaker Johnson. To what extent is the ineffectiveness we've seen so far in the House going to factor into the campaign in 2024, not only for the House, but for the White House?
Well, in a presidential election, of course, the most important thing is the president. But if you surmise that the election will, at the very least, be close, I think the Democrats think that the chances of retaking the House are very, very good because they have had a nonstop chaos clown show. And that's not just me, that's them describing their own fellow Republicans. We saw Chip Roy, very conservative House member from Texas, get on the floor and say, what am I going to run on? Name me one thing that we have done that is positive, that is constructive. And of course, there hasn't been. The Democrats have supplied the votes to avoid a default on the debt. The Democrats have supplied the votes to keep us afloat. And other than that, the Republicans have simply engaged in these absurd investigations, histrionics, and really have shown themselves to be incapable of governing. So if I had to be on a betting team, I would certainly bet on the Democrats. And remember, their deficit now will go down by one, frankly, if George Santos is thrown out later this week, but is only a few. So just as Republicans only had a few seats that they had to flip in 2022, Democrats in 2024 will only need a handful to be able to push back the majority in their direction.
I feel like Wolf Blitzer saying this, but breaking news, we've just heard that Henry Kissinger has died, and I'm sure that will figure in on Sunday, our conversation on December 3rd at 10 a.m. Pacific time in the crisis briefing with Yossi Klein Halevi and Rabbi Edward Feinstein, because Henry Kissinger, a high-profile Jewish member of the Nixon cabinet, influential in a lot of diplomacy of the last 50 years in this country. So we'll find out more about that. Now, we have just a few minutes before we have to wrap up. So I'll ask this and then ask you to deliver us a hopeful bit at the end. A question about how to cover a man like Trump, who can lie and not care if anybody says he's a liar, and his followers not believe it. Your former editor, Marty Barron, has written in his book about how what is needed to cover people like this is just more good reporting, more investigative reporting to put in front of people. But what do you think about the nature of coverage that, and have the lessons been learned from, say, 2016, when CNN treated Trump rallies like free wallpaper on their news coverage?
Well, I fear that not enough lessons have been learned. And I think what is essential is for them to resist this urge, which seems at times overwhelming, to level the playing field, to look at the race and say, well, Donald Trump has some deficits. He's a criminal. He's crazy. He tried to overthrow the government. So we should present some deficits that President Biden has. So you get weeks of coverage that he is old. Newsflash, yes, he's old. Newsflash number two, he's only 3 years older than Donald Trump, and he's not insane. So I think that's an example of how the press tries to somehow even the playing field. You can attribute that to their desire to keep the race interesting and to keep eyeballs there, or you can simply attribute to the fact that they feel terribly uncomfortable saying bad things about one side. Well, when one side is doing bad things over and over and is doing historically horrible things, untenable things, it's their obligation to say so. And you have begun to see little instances here and there in which they're doing so. I think the use of fascist language rattled some of them, and it should. But I think they need to be more candid, more blunt to describe what is going on in front of them. How many times have you read in an account or heard on a report at a rally, President Trump attacked or argued that? He doesn't make an argument, he rambles, he issues screeds. The average person, I don't think, has an appreciation, because it's all chopped up in little sound bites, how insane he sounds and how completely discombobulated and disaffected he is, and how nuts he sounds. And so I think the urge to kind of normalize him, to normalize the election, has to be resisted, and more candor, more truth, and more perspective. I think there has to be a greater respect for historians who are explaining the context of this. I was very pleased, by the way, to see the president hold up Heather Cox Richardson's book that he bought at a bookstore, who is one of the great historians who explains the moment that we're in. Or
and just to tell you, I'll be interviewing her here in January, so I hope everybody will watch.
Fabulous. I just had her on my own podcast, Shameless Plug, Jen Rubin's Green Room. She is fabulous. She will put Trump in a amazingly tightly argued and fascinating context of American history. And that's what we need too. We need perspective. We need to hear from her, from people like Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is another specialist in totalitarianism. She who wrote the book Strongman, that they need to consult with people who have dealt with, studied fascism, authoritarian movements, because that's what we're experiencing right now. And so candor and context would be my hope for the media.
So we'll ask you for maybe 40 seconds in honor of David Lehrer, our late beloved co-founder, to wrap this up on as positive a note as you can muster.
Well, thank you for bringing up David. We all miss him dearly, and what a tremendous voice he was. As David, I think, lived his life and tried to impress on everyone, is This is a democracy. We have agency. We have the ability to engage. People say, oh, there's nothing I can do. Of course there is. You can volunteer. You can give money. You can write to congresspeople and senators. You can show up at events. You can peacefully demonstrate. You can give money to organizations that support democracy, that litigate on behalf of human rights and civil rights. We are all players in a democracy, and we each have a network. We are 2,600 strong at this moment, and each of those 2,600 people has their own network.
Right.
So use your voice, use your platform. Don't shy away from sharing information with people who may be terribly misinformed or uninformed. And for goodness sakes, make sure your children and your children's friends are registered and do vote. It is going to be essential for young people to turn out. They turned out in 2020, they turned out in 2022, and we need them. And the stakes for them have never been greater. So get in the game is, I guess, my message.
We look forward to speaking to you the next time you can join us. Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pat.
And we want to remind you of the special Sunday program coming up. You'll be seeing on the screen in a moment who will be there and when. You can join us 10 a.m. Pacific time with Yossi Klein Halevi and Rabbi Ed Feinstein and all the rest of the program for this month and next. Thanks for joining us so much.